Hello.
Celebrity Family Feud, $100,000 pyramid match game. Steve Harvey, Michael Strahan, Alec Baldwin. Busting fun and games only on ABC.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Hi, everybody. Just want to give a couple more minutes to see if anyone else will sign on, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. I'm going to start my screen share so we can kind of see the slides together. As you can see, this is the introduction session for Sankofa sessions. I just want to start just briefly with the agenda of introducing myself and running through the things you see on the screen. So I just want to start. My name is Tiffany Poe. Most of you that I can see online right now know me in some form or fashion. So it's good to see everybody again. I'm very excited to have you here. One thing I want to say, I've added everybody that I think had joined recently. I added you to the Google Hangout because I want you to be able to talk as well. I tell my students all the time, I hate nothing more than lecture. So hopefully this will be a conversation and everybody puts in their 2 cents and we're able to talk together. I also wanted just to tell you a little bit about my background. My name is Tiffany Pogue, as I said. I'm an assistant professor at Albany State University, where I teach in the College of Education. My background, though, is in Africana Studies. It's something that I've had a passion for all of my life. I tell my friends all the time that I grew up in a household where my father claims he's the one who invented the slogan, "Black is beautiful." So I grew up knowing, having a pride for myself and for my people. My first doll ever was called the Soul Sister doll, and she was dressed in bell-bottom jeans, a red turtleneck, and she had Black Power sayings all over her clothes. So that's kind of who I am and what I've been doing. And I also wanted to just give you a background on why I wanted to do the Sankofa sessions. As I said, I'm teaching in the College of Education, and I never get to teach Black history, so I'm not having conversations as often as I would like about Black history and Black culture. It's something that I have a passion for. And I know that recently there have been a lot of things coming out, like the Underground series that John Legend produces on WGN, and also the remake of Roots. And so there is a lot of interest now in Black history and culture, and I just wanted to be part of that conversation. I think it's important that we share information with one another, and we learn as much as we can about our history and our culture. And I just wanted to have a part in that and to do that. So that's kind of where I am. I wanted to start with what Sankofa sessions are, what I imagine them to be. So I've given you a little bit of that. And then in case you're not familiar, I'm sorry, I was checking to make sure everybody could hear me. And if you're not familiar with Sankofa, I wanted to move forward. Now, I wanted to say this. There are probably varying degrees of familiarity with some of these topics. So if they start to get too basic, kind of interject and let me know that we need to go more in depth. Or if I'm too far ahead of you with the ideas, then please stop me there too. You see that there is a chat window. If you have something you want to say or anything like that, let me know and we can talk through that. So let's get started. Okay. So what is Sankofa? Sankofa is from the Akan language of Ghana. It's also called Twi, T-W-I, Twi. And in that language, Sankofa can be broken into the word san, which means to return, ka, which is usually spelled with a symbol that looks like a backwards C, and fa, to take or to fetch. So altogether, the word Sankofa literally means to return, to go, and to take it. It's often represented, you see the thing that looks like a heart there in the upper right corner? That's normally how Sankofa is represented in Adinkra, A-D-I-N-K-R-A, Adinkra. Adinkra is a system of visual proverbs. I think I like that term. They're visual proverbs. So for someone who is literate in the symbols of Adinkra, whenever they see the heart that looks like that in your upper right corner, then they are being reminded to return, to go, and to fetch. Now, Adinkra are symbols that were initially used in funerary cloth. If you look at the bottom of the slide, those textiles are hand stamped. The symbols communicate something again to the people who are able to read them. And so whenever you would encounter Sankofa in Adinkra cloth, then it's reminding you that there is some important element from the past that you need to retrieve to move forward. That's why Sankofa is also represented as the bird that you see there on the slide. The body of the bird is often forward-facing with the head turned backwards, either retrieving an egg or the seed. And again, it represents the idea that while you're moving forward, it's essential to turn to the past, not to recreate the past, but to pull from the past those essential elements that we need to move forward. And that brings us to the next thing. Again, today is kind of an introductory session, and I just wanted to set the foundation for what we'll need to move forward. And so the question of why we study history is one that's important to address. You'll see some of my favorite quotes there about why we study history. And perhaps my absolute favorite is the one by Carter G. Woodson there on the right. Carter G. Woodson, as many of us may know, was a historian. He was an educator, and he is also the founder of what was then called Negro History Week, which eventually developed into Black History Month. And so we thank Mr. Woodson for his contributions to the study of Black history and culture. And you see there in the quote, he says, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history." And Carter G. Woodson, who wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, argued that the American public school system does little to prepare Black students, Black people in general, to have any significant understanding of their own history and contributions to American civilization. And because of that, then we're not challenged to do better because we don't know what has been done before us. Now, I don't have any quotes by Na'im Akbar on the screen, but he is also someone who writes a lot about why it's important for us to study history. Na'im Akbar has a concept called the legacy of competence. Again, the legacy of competence. Akbar, who is an educational psychologist, he used to teach at Florida State University. I'm not sure if he's still teaching. But Akbar used to make the argument that when a student can look back and see the contributions of their people, then they are inspired to do more and to do better. And conversely, if a student cannot see what Akbar calls the legacy of competence within their people, then they're not motivated to do more, to do better. Let me give you a prime example of what Akbar is talking about. When I was at FAMU, all the time, math is not my subject. I am I love history now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But more than anything else, I'm probably a literature person, English language arts literature person. And so while I was at FAM, I needed to take psychological statistics. And I was going to take it during the summer, and everyone tried to talk me out of it because it was an abbreviated course, which meant it was going to move very quickly, and it was going to be a lot of complicated math to work the formulas to get to the ideas and the principles in the class. And I will never forget the very first day of class, the professor says, "Who is awful in math?" And I think my hand probably was the first one raised because I don't like math and I didn't see myself as good with it. And I would say a good 90% of the class had raised their hands as well. And instead of fussing at us, the professor went into a class-long lecture about how mathematics had made the pyramids possible in Egypt. And then he talked to us about how the pyramids are in Africa. And he made the argument that if your ancestors could do that, which cannot be duplicated, we know the pyramids, they can't figure them out now, how that engineering feat was accomplished. If they had the math to do that, then certainly we in an air-conditioned classroom with books and computers and each other to study with could certainly master psychological statistics in a summer. And I got an A out of the class. And I think part of it is what psychologists call efficacy. Efficacy is the idea that if you think you are smart, you tend to be smart. And if you think you suck at something, you tend to suck at it. Partially because when we think we're smart, we do things that smart people do. And again, that supports Na'im Akbar's idea of the legacy of competence. If our children know the excellence that they come from, then they are challenged to uphold that excellence. Now, this is also why it's important that our study of Black history does not start in slavery. If you start our analysis in slavery, then it looks like we've come a long way, right? There are some Black business owners. We have a Black president. Many of us have good jobs, drive nice cars. We don't have to deal with explicit racism daily. Now, notice I said explicit because we live in an oppressive society. We do have to deal with it daily. But the explicit in your face, Jim Crow type laws, we don't have to face anymore. And when we compare those accomplishments to living as a person enslaved, then it does look like we've come a very long way. The reality, however, is that when you look at history over time and space, then the people who built the pyramids have no business owning as little land as we own, or investing in our own businesses as little as we do, or having as little control over school systems as we do. And so if we use history as a barometer from where we are challenged even more when we extend our understanding of history past the period of enslavement. And so that brings me to the next point of how I want to move forward. But as I talk about how I want to move forward, I also want to say something about terms. You will not hear me call them slaves. And I'm very intentional about that. When we call our ancestors slaves, it tends to remove the humanity from the conversation. When we think slaves, we think of almost mindless, faceless masses in fields being oppressed. And because we think of them that way, they lose their humanity, something that they were never willing to do when they were alive. Instead, they were people who were enslaved. They were people who had hopes and dreams and aspirations, who wanted to do something, who wanted to maintain something, who wanted to raise children. They had likes and dislikes and pleasures and fears and all of the things that we have today. But every time we lump them under the name slave, they lose a piece of that in our minds. And so it's very important to me that I don't do that, that I refer to them as enslaved people instead of as slaves. I just wanted to say that because you'll hear me probably sound a little awkward by making sure I say that phrase, but it's important to me. It's very important to me. The other thing that you'll notice in my language is that I use African and Black synonymously. For me, they're interchangeable. Malcolm X famously said that if a cat gives birth in an oven, we don't call the kittens biscuits. They're still cats. They're still kittens. And so when our ancestors were brought here and they had children, they were giving birth to Africans. Africans giving birth to other Africans still equal Africans. Now, our context is a little different and some of our cultural understandings are different. But nonetheless, we are part of a longer history. Our history doesn't start in the United States. And so I use that term. Now, what you very seldom will hear me say is African American. And I want to explain why that is. I used that term a lot before I moved to Miami. And when I moved to Miami, I realized that there were plenty of Black folk there who did not want to be associated with African Americans. And when I was talking about them and lumping them into African American, I was disrespecting their desires to be something different. They all classify themselves as Black, but they wanted us to remember that their lived experiences was not quite the same as those of us born in the US. And so I tend towards the terms Black and African American rather than African American. And occasionally I'll use African when I'm talking about a longer trajectory of history. And speaking of trajectories of history, I want to show you something called the historical spiral cycle. I hated history in high school because for far too long, it was just about plotting dates on a timeline. I could never remember the dates. They weren't important to me. Who gives a care, what exact date the World War II happened? What to me was important was the story. And the story was often lost because the teachers and the professors were so concerned with the dates. And it wasn't until at Fort Valley State University, I had a professor introduce me to the historical spiral cycle that history became a passion of mine. And that's what's on this screen now, the historical spiral cycle. It was offered by Okoto in the book called The Sankofa Movement. And it's a way of looking at history without using a timeline. So, we have a timeline that goes straight forward from past into present, and you just kind of see we plot dates on the timeline and that kind of thing. Well, the historical spiral cycle, as you note on the slide, there are no dates. What it is talking about the seasons of change. And so I want to walk you through that. At the very top of the poll, at the infinity, and notice that it's like an infinity symbol because time in African thought. One of probably the next session that I do will be on indigenous African cultural thought and practice. But in traditional African thought, time is cyclical. It doesn't move in a line. It moves in circles. And that's why Big Mama can come to you in a dream and give you the numbers for the next day, because time, even though she may have passed away years ago, time still allows her to revisit because it's cyclical. It's also why we have colored people time and we never show up on time, because time doesn't have these hard and fast markers in it. Things happen when they're supposed to happen in African cultural thought. And so the spiral cycle is less concerned with dates than it is with the season or the time period in which something is happening. And so when things are at peace and we have order and everything is working the way it's supposed to, then according to the spiral cycle, we call that Ma'at. Ma'at is an ancient Egyptian term. She's also a deity in ancient Egypt. She's the goddess of balance and of peace and righteousness. And so when things are at Ma'at, then everything's working according to plan. Things are going well for a society or for a people or what have you. Now, what moves us away from this total ideal of balance is when we voluntarily move away from what we know we should be doing. So Ma'at is a voluntary divergence from the things that have given us order. And Ogonye is the term that is used to describe that movement. Ogonye is from the Shona language, the Shona people of Zimbabwe. Ogonye represents this voluntary movement. There's an African proverb that says, if there is no enemy within, then the enemy without cannot harm you. And Ogonye is that idea. It's not until you start to move away from those things that have sustained you, move away from the practices and beliefs that have made you okay, that now that you have weakened yourself for external enemies to attack. And so that's the period of Ogonye. Once you have moved away from the things that have protected you, now you're open for your enemies to come in and disrupt you even further. And that is the period of Ma'afa, which is a Kiswahili term. Marimba Ani gives it to us when she talks about the period of the transatlantic slave trade as Ma'afa. This is destruction of a people from outside. So Ogonye are the problems that a people face because of internal conflict. Ma'afa is the period where what is happening from the outside and is disrupting life. Again, Ma'afa has been used to describe the period of colonialism and slavery. Now, Ma'afa is the deliberate destruction of a people's humanity and culture. And what tends to happen if Ma'afa happens too long is that people will fall into the term Isfet, which again is I think that one is also Egyptian. I have to double check that one. But Isfet is the idea of maximal disorder. So it's the opposite of Ma'at. Now we're in complete chaos. People have lost their sovereignty. They are completely controlled by external forces. So none of the decisions that they are making are their own. So this is the period of chaos where people are under the purview of somebody else. They're not making internal decisions for themselves. Decisions are being made, the people are being manipulated, etc. And that all becomes possible, again, because they voluntarily moved away from their principles so that external enemies could attack, and that's what led to the chaos. Now, all hope is not lost. I also want to point out that this period of leaving Ma'at and falling into chaos is called a komko. It's deterioration. We are losing things, a komko, okay? And then once we're in chaos, though, that there are some people who will start to remember. And they'll start to say, hey, wait a minute. If we look at history, our people have had some problems before and we've been able to overcome them. What do we need to do? And we start looking for the practices, the philosophies, the institutions that once held us together, and we start trying to rebuild them. And that process of beginning to remember how things are is called Kefra. Kefra is the scarab beetle in Egypt. It represents transformation. So you're transforming from complete chaos to once again trying to remember what those things were that kept you in Ma'at in the first place. So Kefra is a period of remembering. And after you begin to remember, then it's time to reestablish. So Koroko is the period of reestablishment, where we move forward looking to rebuild those institutions that were lost. One of my favorite novels is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which describes the period of colonization coming to West Africa, Nigeria, the area of Nigeria in particular. And in it, one of my favorite lines is, "The white man is very clever. He has put a knife to the things that have bound us together," right? And so Koroko is us recognizing that those things which were disrupted that once held us together, we have to reinstitutionalize. We have to make them official. We have to bring them back together. So if it is true that families were disrupted as a result of Ma'afa and Isfet, we need to reestablish families. If it is true that the kinds of schools we had prior to European colonization and enslavement, then we need to reinstitute those schooling practices. Whatever those things were that helped us have Ma'at, we need to rebuild them. So that's the historical spiral cycle in a nutshell. That's how the Sankofa sessions will talk about history. Again, the emphasis will not be on dates. The emphasis really is on how does our behavior allow people to manipulate us or not? How do we move from a period where we have no say and no control over our own bodies and lives to instituting those practices, policies, and beliefs that allow us to have that sovereignty again? And so we'll talk about Sankofa is the period of rebirth, where we reestablish ourselves. And that's what these Sankofa sessions will attempt to help us do. And so I wanted to move forward to just setting up the next few sessions by talking about two prevailing schools of thought about African history in the Americas, Black history in the West. The two schools of thought can be summarized by the two gentlemen on the screen. Now, these are not the only scholars who have written about how we should think about African history. There are plenty other people. The debate is still ongoing. But suffice it to say, these are two of the biggest names when we think about these things. One is E. Franklin Frazier, and the other is Melville Herskovits. As you can see, one is a Black man and one is a white man. They think very differently. E. Franklin Frazier was a trained sociologist. Melville Herskovits was a trained cultural anthropologist. And so these two gentlemen had very different ideas of what happened to Africans as a result of slavery. According to E. Franklin Frazier, because slavery was so horrific and so violent and so long-lasting, those African cultural memories that the first enslaved people would have had are so far diluted that what we have remaining in the West, meaning the United States, South America, Central America, those African traits are pretty much gone. They're so far diluted that what we have here is something completely different. It is a black diaspora culture that is different from African culture. Melville Herskovits, on the other hand, agreed that slavery was horrific. He agreed that it caused culture to shift, but where he differed from Frazier was he didn't believe that African culture was diluted and missing as a result of slavery. What Herskovits thought was that it had simply gone into hiding in a kind of way. He believed that African culture was tenacious, that it lasted through the period of slavery. And for those people careful enough to look at African culture in the West, you would see traces of African indigenous culture. His idea leads us to a concept called Africanisms. Some people call them Africanisms. Holloway calls them Africanisms. Other people call them African cultural carryovers. It's the idea that there are some things that we do and we don't necessarily remember why we do them. Nonetheless, they are very African. So I'm going to tell you a little story that one of my mentors used to tell me about an anthropologist who wanted to study Southern cooking. And because he wanted to study Southern cooking, he went to a Black woman's house. You know, who else better to teach you about Southern cooking? And he watched her prepare a ham one day. And so she took the piece of pork out and she washed it and she seasoned it up and everything. And then she cut off both ends before she put it into a pan. And so he asked her, I understand why you washed it. I understand why you seasoned it. Can you tell me why you cut off the ends of the ham before you put it in a pan? And she said, I don't really know. I don't know why I do that. I just, that's the way my mama taught me how to do it. When I watched her cook ham, that's what she did. He said, well, can we talk to your mother? She said, sure, she's in the other room. Let me go get her. So they go get the mother, and the mother comes out, and she says, yeah, my mama taught me to cut the ends off the ham. I'm not sure why we do it. That's just what she taught me to do. When I watched her cook ham, that's what she did. She cut the ends off. I'm not sure why she did it. And the man said, well, is she still living? She said, yeah, she lives right around the corner. He said, well, can we go over to your mother's house and ask her why she cut the ends off the ham? So now we're 2 generations deep, right? We're going to the 3rd generation to find out why the ends of the ham are cut off. So they walk around the corner to the great-grandmother's house, and she's sitting there. He asks her, ma'am, I'm watching your granddaughter and your daughter cook ham, and they cut the ends off before they put it in the pan. Can you tell me why? And she starts laughing, and she said, because my pan wasn't big enough to hold the whole thing. I always had to trim the ends to make it fit. And so that's the idea that Herskovits is talking about, that there are some things that we continue to do that are very African. We have inherited them, even if we don't remember that they're African anymore. So we may not know why we do certain things. That doesn't mean that they're no longer African. Another example of that is how in hip hop, it's not unusual to see people pour beer on the corner for the homies who aren't here, right? As a remembrance of them. In African culture, we call that libation. That very seldom will a spiritual or social event happen without first giving homage to the ancestors who's gone on before by pouring some kind of water or strong drink, liquor, onto the ground. So there is an African practice. We may not recognize it as African anymore, but it nonetheless is. And so Herskovits was arguing for that kind of cultural inheritance. So while Fraser was saying slavery was so horrific that it changed us completely from our African selves, Herskovits was saying, no, wait a minute. The practices are still here, even if the people don't remember that they are African. What Herskovits was talking about is something we call syncretism. Now, both men happened to study in Brazil to look at some differences between some people. Fraser was arguing that in Brazil, yes, you could see more African culture and practice than you could in the United States. But even in Brazil, what you were seeing was being diluted daily, and eventually it would cease to be African as well. Herskovits argued, no, what we see in Brazil is an example of syncretism. Syncretism. So the 2 images I have on the screen there, when we do the session on African cultural thought and African spirituality, I'll go into greater detail, but suffice it to say that the figure on the left represents the Yoruba Orisha or deity Shango. Shango is the god, for lack of a better word, the god of thunder and lightning. He is the Orisha of justice. He is a royal Orisha. He doesn't like liars, and his colors, as you can see there, are often represented as red and white. He deals with fire, and as you see, the lightning coming from his double-headed axe. In Brazil, during the period of enslavement, and Brazil actually got 40% of enslaved people brought into the West were brought to Brazil. So while we tend to center Black culture in the United States as the Black culture of the Americas, in fact, there are more Black folk in Brazil as the result of slavery than in the US. And so in Brazil, when the Yoruba people were enslaved, the Portuguese denied them the rights to worship Shango out in the open in Brazil, right? As was the case in the United States, African spirituality was something feared by the enslavers, and so they often denied enslaved people rights and access to their own spiritual traditions. But the Yoruba people in Brazil weren't stupid. So what they did was they identified the Catholic Saint Barbara, there represented on the right, and they looked at her and they noticed that she's holding something that looks like lightning. She's dressed in Shango's colors. Now, in Yoruba land, Shango is also associated with a white horse. And it is not unusual for you to see pictures of Saint Barbara also on a white horse. So when enslaved people were threatened with the idea of having to abandon Shango, they turned their attention to Saint Barbara. The same thing happened in Cuba. When you had enslaved Yoruba, also called Lukumi in Cuba, looking for a way to hide their practices in plain sight, they hid the worship of Shango behind the Catholic Saint Barbara. And so what Herskovits was arguing, this idea of syncretism, hiding one deity behind another, is why people like Fraser could not see the African culture continuing, because enslaved people were clever enough to hide it from people who would have taken it from them. They hid it from people who would have stopped them from worshiping. Even though they in public worshiped Saint Barbara, during their initiation practices and rituals, it was still Shango. So that Saint Barbara became the public face for Shango, which remained the core of the tradition. So this was the big debate between Fraser and Herskovits, the idea of the dilution versus syncretism that these men were having. Now, as we move forward, what I want to do is to use, I naturally fall in line with Herskovits' argument about African cultural carryovers. To me, there is something that we can think about called the African historical meta-narrative, meaning our history in this country does not begin in the United States. Asa G. Hilliard, a well-known educational psychologist, argued that unfortunately, Black people tended to study our own history as if there was an iron curtain around the borders of the United States and an iron curtain at the year 1492. Meaning, we very seldom think of history of Black folk before the United States was a place as our own history. And because of that, we limit ourselves. We limit our understandings of ourselves, and we limit ourselves to access to what Akbar called the legacy of competence. If we are able to extend our understanding of African cultural reality beyond the borders of the United States and beyond the border of 1492, then we're able to understand our relationships to other Black people globally in a different kind of way. And the understanding of our similarities throughout the diaspora means that we begin to connect ourselves to something bigger than that which is in the United States. It means that we begin to understand ourselves as a global population, not a minority. We are not a minority group. Economically, we don't have, even in the United States, economically, we're not a minority group. We spend a whole lot of money. But imagine the trade opportunities, the educational opportunities, the social opportunities. Hell, I'm looking for a man. I have the entire African world to look at. I'm not limited to the United States. Once I understand that we are connected to something much bigger than we've been taught to see before. If you look there at the map, this is the common map of the African diaspora. We ended up everywhere. Everywhere in the world, there are African people. I have a friend that used to say, Africa's been around the world since the world has been round. And we have a lot of history in that. We have a lot of accomplishments in that. And we have a long way to go in understanding who we are. And so these Sankofa sessions, as I envision them, is an opportunity for us to have conversations about, well, what happened there? Well, how does that affect what happens here? And how are our experiences linked in ways that help us understand who each other are? You know, we need to be connected to one another in some different kinds of ways, politically, economically, and socially. I would even argue spiritually, we need to be connected to one another in some different ways. And so that's kind of where we are. I rushed through that because I wanted to leave time for anybody else to talk that wanted to talk, because I want to ask you if these webinars will work for you, and how we move forward from here, where we want to go from here. Do we want to go and concentrate on, which would be my preference, do we want to go to Africa and look at what I call pre-encounter African life? What was African life like before the Europeans arrived, before the Arabs arrived? Because we know the Europeans were not the first to enslave African people. There was an Arabic slave trade long before. And so do we want to learn more about that, or do we want to start in more contemporary history and move backwards? I know that because of the series, the recent remake of Roots and the series Underground, there may be some interest in starting in like 19th century African American history, and then spreading out from there. But I'm open to what you guys think. So I'm going to open the floor. And if you want to give your word, or you just have some questions, some other things you want to talk about, have at it. Anybody? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Like I said, I think we should start in Africa and get it, because I think once the example I will use is the Congo. If we have a better understanding of how Congo kingdom was organized, how the period of Europeans coming first as missionaries affected that organization, and then how that weakened it, so that you can see the historical spiral cycle at work. Because what you see is that you have a sovereign kingdom, very sophisticated in its trade practices and politics, even in its conflict resolution. And then when you have these Jesuit priests coming in, they start to disrupt things in such a way that opens the kingdom up and weakens it so much so that now the period of enslavement is possible. If you watch Roots, that's kind of what is happening in Roots too. You have a sovereign kingdom with peace accords and agreements between various ethnic groups. When the Europeans come in, they start to play people against each other, and you see how they are weakened in such a way that now enslavement is possible. Okay, I think so that's what we'll do. We'll move forward with that. I also wanted to ask, you guys can type in the chat box. I also wanted to ask if you want to do these monthly, or if you want to do them twice a month, maybe every other week. What works best for you? Eventually, I would want to be able to travel and come to some different places so that we can, as the old people say, set eyes on each other and do it together. But I'm open to that as well. Yay, Annette. Okay. I think bi-monthly works too. And so what I'll do in the coming days is send out a email with the email address that you all registered with. I'll send out an email with that on it, with the announcement of the day and the time. We'll probably stick to Sundays at 8. Hopefully the BET wars won't hit us again, which is probably what happened. So we'll do it in about 2 weeks. And we'll move forward with talking a little bit about pre-encounter African history. When you hear me say pre-encounter, what I'm saying is before Europeans came and messed stuff up. So we'll do pre-encounter African history in a couple of weeks. We'll aim for Sunday, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and try to keep it that way. What I'll probably do when I send out the link is also send you a list of some books If what we're doing is not enough and you want to read more about a particular thing, then I want to make that available to you. And let me just show you the book that I was referencing earlier. I don't know if you can see this. It's called The Sankofa Movement by a husband and wife out of DC. And one of the things I like about them is they have one of the oldest independent Black schools in the country. And so they students this, and they have a conference yearly. The Sankofa conference is yearly, and it's kind of one of those things where you have to know somebody in the network before you can find out about it. And so I'm a little bit out of the swing of things, but hopefully I can reconnect with them, and if I can, I'll share that information, because that's a wonderful opportunity to see how the reinstitutionalization of our practices can happen. Because what they saw was a need in DC for community-controlled education, and they started their own school. And I think they're about 40 years old, and so they have some institutional memory, and they definitely have good advice on how to move forward. But I do recommend the book. The Sankofa Movement is very practical. It talks about how we can remember some things. It talks about how we can also have some details on, you know, just some advice on how you want to organize if you want to start community centers and that kind of thing. It has just practical advice on how to move forward. So what I can do is every time we have a subject, I can collect some books and just do a little brief bibliography list that you can download. I'll figure out how to work the technology so that there'll be a little download button for you to download things in the future. There is also a way for me to save these broadcasts to YouTube. I still have to figure that out. But once I do that, then I'll also send those links out to you later, so that if there's something you want to rewatch, or you want to re-engage, or you want to share it with somebody, you can. I just feel like at this moment in time, we need to be in conversations about how to do better. And I think one of the first things we have to do in doing better is to learn how it's been done before. All right. All right. So I had fun. I talked a lot, and y'all didn't talk as much as I did. But I hope that in the future we can do more, and I look forward to seeing you then. I'll send out the information. Take care. Love you guys.